Welcome to the Why God Why podcast. I am here as a host, Peter Englert, Adult Ministries pastor at Browncroft Community Church. I'm also here with our sub-producer, not sub because he's second chair quarterback, but sub because it's a vacation week, is Dave Bodie. He also edits some of our podcasts. I'm here with our guest, David Hertweck. He's a pastor at Trinity Assembly in Clay, New York. We've had him on before. He was in our first season and first couple episodes, and we're continuing our series on grief. And the question we're engaging today is this: why doesn't my grief have an end date? And just as a reminder, my usual co-host John Amayo isn't here. His mom passed away from the coronavirus, and little did we know that this series would come in 2020. We kind of knew that people were grieving for various different reasons, knowing that a co-host would lose, their mom, but also just kind of knowing that 2021 is coming, at least at the recording of this, but it's here. We just wanted to take a moment, whether you're grieving because you've lost someone or you don't know that you're grieving, but you are. We wanted to talk about this topic, and I think Dave brings a unique perspective on this question: why doesn't my grief have an end date? So Dave, I'm glad to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Peter. It's good to be with you. It's always nice to be invited back somewhere. You can get invited to something on accident the first time, but when you get invited back, it feels like, okay, I didn't mess up too much the first time.
Well, a lot of our podcast listeners are wondering why I keep getting asked. No, but that's anyways. And I will say this: it's weird not having a co-host. So I'm a little off my game, but I think we're ready. Why don't we start here, Dave? We've been asking every guest this, but how do you define grief?
Yeah, when I think of grief, I guess I think of it in two ways. I think of grief as an emotion, an experience, but also as a process. So I guess for me, grief is the way in which we holistically respond to the experience or reality of loss. So it's the way in which I threw the word holistic in because grief can feel like it's happening on one level only. But the reality is that, in my experience anyway, grief has such an impact beyond just our emotions. It impacts us physically. It impacts us spiritually. It impacts us mentally. And so grief is this holistic response to the experience and the reality of loss. And sometimes the experience of loss and the reality of loss aren't always the same thing. So that's why I think it's helpful to put both of those words in there.
I like how you did that. And before we kind of get into your personal story, a lot of people have talked about 2020 being a year of grief. You can put it up there with unprecedented, pivot, and you've talked about it as holistically. As you look back to 2020, and as the airing of this is in 2021, would you describe 2020 as the year of grief? How would you kind of share that or understand that? Because again, what you're saying is it's not just a feeling, like it's even the way you behave and think, and I don't know. I'd just be curious about that.
Yeah. I mean, the way to answer the question is with a question, which would be, do you feel like 2020 was a year of loss? And if it was a year of loss, then it was undoubtedly a year of grief. And, I think there was this collective experience that maybe makes us feel selfish if we grieve if we grieve in a way that is too public or that is too pronounced, especially if we didn't lose someone. If someone in our family didn't pass away from COVID this year, you almost feel like, well, I really shouldn't be sad about 2020 because my family is here. They're alive. We made it through. I have a job. Financially, we're stable. There's crises related to COVID around the world that have not touched all of us. But, turning grief into some sort of a comparison game is a dangerous place because you're not responsible to grieve for somebody else's year. You're responsible to understand, own, and grieve for the things that you've lost in 2020. So, for me as a pastor of a local church, and this will feel so sort of trite potentially, I'm just trying to make a point that we all have to pay attention to what we've lost, whether it's big or small. whether it's profound or, not that significant. When COVID really started to blow up in our communities in February and in March, I think when churches first shut down, some of us who were optimistic thought, well, we'll wait this out a few weeks and we'll come back on Easter Sunday and it will be this amazing celebration. Of course, for churches, Easter Sunday is Super Bowl. It's like, this is the Sunday where everybody that's going to show up shows up. You put all your effort, you put, to play on a pun, you put your eggs in one basket and you just do everything you can. And losing Easter Sunday, I know we all did stuff online, but losing the Easter Sunday gathering, the momentum that churches can build off of that, losing Christmas Eve in some cases, losing a summertime church picnic where everybody can be together, losing regular youth all that sort of stuff. Like, I think we have to process that stuff, not make too much of it, because in the end, there were bigger losses in 2020 for many, but also don't overlook it because it affects us.
Well, and I think where I struggle is a lot of churches during Christmas were getting this feedback like, you're too positive. Like, Christmas is going to be awesome. And even just as we get to the new year, it's not just churches. I think there's organizations that are getting this other feedback where it's like, 2020 is not going to be the best year ever. Like, let's just get through it. Like, don't jinx it. But on the same token, like, this has been a hard year. And it's almost like the culture around us is telling us, like, you have to be in this middle ground. You can't be too positive, and then you can't be too negative. And I just think, I think that even thinking about this series of grief, like, I mean, are you even allowed to celebrate, if you get a job promotion? Like, because you have 4 friends that didn't get a job. Like, I feel like we're getting told to do everything, which is really nothing, all in the sort.
Yeah, I get that. And obviously in this day and age, the backlash is so swift, with social media and with just the heightened level of communication. But I think there is some wisdom in reading the room, having a feel for what the community is walking through. Here where I live in Syracuse, we're in Onondaga County, and this week alone, 69 people, I think, lost their lives related to COVID, right? So for me to get up in the pulpit and make light in any way of COVID would just be so tone deaf and so unkind and so unsympathetic. And so I think we have to have considerations for those in our community who have suffered much and are celebrating the holiday without someone that they love. I also think that as Christians, as pastors, as ministry leaders, the good news that we ultimately have to offer does not hinge on any of the things I just described. It's deeper than all of that. It's more real than all of that. And so I wouldn't make any apologies for celebrating the birth of our Savior. If anything, it's these moments that makes it even more necessary and more worth celebrating.
Man, I feel like we're teed up for this kind of next question, because I really, hearing you say read the room, one of the things I appreciate about you, Dave, is you are really thoughtful and you really think about things deeply. And before 2020, you had some personal experiences with grief. And, just to have someone say read the room kind of tells me you've read the room of your own heart. So I guess what I'm curious about is, can you share with our listeners what your experience with grief is?
Yeah. So in the end of 2016, my dad, who he would have been 66 at the time, was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. This happened right around Thanksgiving of 2016. And if our listeners know anything about pancreatic cancer, it's one of the worst kinds in the sense that there's no treatment for it. And by the time you're feeling the symptoms of it, you're almost always in stage 4. Stage 4 meaning it's spread beyond the pancreas. So it became clear early on that there was no surgical solution, and that while chemotherapy was available, it was not chemotherapy specific to pancreatic cancer. That doesn't currently exist. So, this was a pretty jarring pretty jarring news for us to process as a family. My mom, my sister, who's 2 years older than me, myself, my brother, who's 7 years younger than me, and then my sister has 4 kids, and I have 3 kids. And so we walked through that season in a very different way than normal. Everything felt different, with the reality of this could be it. Outside of some sort of miracle, this will be my dad's last Thanksgiving. This will be his last Christmas. And the chemo was totally ineffective. Nothing against the doctors, of course. It just wasn't effective. And he ended up staying home until he passed away on February 15th. Was it 15th or 16th? 2017. And we had his services on February 19th, which would have been his 67th birthday. And so, that was a difficult journey. It was about 2 months from diagnosis to his death. And so, you have some opportunity to have some conversations and to say some things and to capture some moments. And I'm thankful for that. If there's any gift about a diagnosis like that, it's that you do have some time to do some things that need to be done. We're from a faith tradition that believes that if God wants to heal somebody, he certainly can. It's not on demand. He doesn't owe it to us, and we can't conjure it up. But every now and then, I think the kingdom of God breaks in on the kingdom of earth, and we see incredible things. And that can be a physical miracle. It could be the reconciliation of a marriage. It could be kindness in our hearts. That's all the kingdom breaking in. And so I think our prayer was, God, if it's in your will, we'd love to see the kingdom break in on these cancer cells and just do something incredible for your glory. That's not what God chose. And so he passed away. He was the founding pastor. Him and my mom had co-pastored this church. So there were layers to that grief journey, because my mom was still technically a co-senior pastor, but in her grief journey, really not in a place to lead the way the church needed to be led in that season. I, at the time, was serving a network of churches, about 330 churches in the state of New York, called the Assemblies of God. And thankfully, they allowed me to fill the pulpit for my dad when I could, and to kind of serve as a teaching pastor for the rest of 2017. And then at the end of 2017, I submitted my name for consideration and was elected to serve. And I've been there as the lead pastor since 2018. What made that year more complex was that in October of the same year, October 7th, my younger brother, who was, he would have been 32 or 33, he passed away suddenly. He was an elementary school teacher in Las Vegas, Nevada. And I remember, with grief, there's certain moments you wish you could forget, but you'll never forget. Specific phone calls, having to call my brother about my dad, getting the phone call about my brother, having to call my sister about my brother, having to drive to my mom's house and tell her about, those are like the moments, like, you kind of wish you could somehow like move on from them, but they're always going to be with you. And so, my mom and I, the next morning, were on a plane to Las Vegas. We got all this stuff. By the way, this was a week after that massive shooting in Las Vegas. I don't know if our listeners remember in 2017, the guy who was up in the hotels who opened fire on an outdoor concert. This is a week later. So getting my brother to the coroner and through that whole thing was a nightmare, because they were processing. There's only one coroner in the whole county of Las Vegas, and they're processing all of that. So long story short, we buried my brother about a week after he passed away. And so, I guess at this point, I'll leave it there. Obviously, 2017 was a nightmare. It was an unthinkable series of losses, and just so disorienting, on so many levels.
So our question today is, why doesn't grief have an end date? And what hit me as you were talking, I mean, we've known each other for years. I'm sure that there's listeners out there, and I'm trying to be careful, because pastoring is kind of the same as any other vocation, but it's also different. But I'm sure there's listeners out there that their parent died and they took over the family business, and every day they have to encounter this grief. And it's different with pastoring, but there are some similarities. I mean, this question of why doesn't my grief have an end date? I mean, do you think about that when you show up? I mean, are you in the same office that your dad? I mean, those were some of the questions that were just kind of going through my mind as you were telling the story.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting right now in his office, and some of these books on the shelf behind me are his books, and there's things hanging on this wall that were here when it was his office that I decided to kind of keep up, and there's a piece of art on this wall over here that I'm looking at that has specific meaning to my brother, and so um, yeah, there is a joy in continuing the work that God had my dad and my mom begin. There's a weight to it. There's a deep responsibility. Um, and there's also this just sense of like, I know my dad would be proud, and I know that he would love that I've followed in his footsteps. And so, one of the things, so in the middle of losing my father and my only brother, I also changed jobs,
Mm,
which in of itself can be a very destabilizing um, event. And so I had to really wrestle through, is this the next step for me because I feel like I have to? Am I acting out of grief in some sort of noble way, thinking like this is what a good son would do? You take his dad's church and make sure things don't fall apart, so to speak. Or am I doing it because this is what God has prepared me to do for all these years? And one of the gifts in this season of grief was Erin and I, my wife, we had such defined clarity that this was our next step. And God had prepared us for this in so many ways before we ever got a diagnosis for my dad that I didn't realize he was preparing us for. And just to speak candidly, it was mostly through other opportunities to take other positions
mm.
that around the country, in higher education, in a different position within this network. And by wrestling through those opportunities, Aaron and I concluded two things. Number one, our next step is going to be back to the local church. And number two, we're not leaving Central New York. So with those two things very clear in our hearts before my dad ever got sick, it made the decision to step into this position, or at least to put my name in for this position, I could trust my motives more because it was sort of settled before the grief journey began. And I think that's one of the ways that God was very good and gracious to us.
Wow. Wow. I love what you even talked about because one of the things I got concerned with, like this was John's idea, and like I was like, no, we shouldn't do grief, and I don't know, maybe I just don't want to talk about sad. I'm usually okay with it, but what I love what you're saying is, and I think it's important for our listeners to hear, like you've gone through grief, not just in the loss of loved ones, but you just talked about grief with, starting a new job. And, I wonder how many people sit back and have those conversations. I mean, are there other examples? I mean, you're talking about a year of 2017. I do want to talk a little bit more about your brother because I think that that's something to just kind of lean into. But I mean, were there any other things that you look back on and you go, man, I was really grieving there? It might not have been directly correlated to an event, but I could tell. I mean, was there anything that you could point out?
One of the things I learned about grief is it's a lot more than sadness.
Mm,
Um, it's so disorienting. It's the best word I can think of. It's so destabilizing. It's hard to think. Um, it's hard to remember. Um, it's 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 it puts such a it's like there would be times in 2017 where I would just feel myself audibly just breathe, just like someone had just like punched me in the gut,
mm.
and it wasn't like, oh man, I'm getting emotional thinking about it. You just like, I think you almost, your body at times just takes over, and it's just like you got to breathe.
I think you and I work on words a lot. And if you're still listening to this podcast, that what Dave just said is that way. Because what we're talking about here is sometimes you don't even know, you don't have words for it. You have tears, you have breathing, and it's just a lot.
Yeah, yeah. I definitely learned that. I'm so grateful for I'm forgetting the scripture reference right now where it says that the Spirit at times prays through us with groans. When we don't have words. I know there's different ways to interpret that, but for me it was like just the heavy sigh. Aaron would see me at times just staring off and just shaking my head side to side like this, just side to side, just like, just like I cannot believe this is where we are at. I just can't believe, and I think, as the oldest son in the family, as the one who needed to step up to the plate too, there are ways in which we learn to delay our grief journey so that we can help others.
Mm.
And I think that's important, but also dangerous. And I had good friends in my life that just made sure that I was feeling it, that I wasn't just pushing it down, that I was aware of how I was doing and what was going on. And it's so, I say holistic, it's like, it affects your emotions so much. Like, one of the things I learned in the season was, I like being in control. Like, one of my sort of heart idols, so to speak, is the feeling of being in control. When you start losing people, when your dad gets diagnosed with cancer and you literally cannot do a single thing to slow down his death, and then your brother passes, and not only can you not control it, you couldn't see it coming, or you didn't see it coming. What I found was my emotional margin for other things that I was trying to control became so thin. So I found myself being very, very short with my daughters. If they were just making noise in the back seat, and I said, "Hey girls, come on, keep it down." And normally I could handle a few interactions before I kind of got frustrated, but it went from 0 to 100. And then I'd be like, well, what is my deal? Like, this isn't me. Like, why am I? And I just realized, like, that loss of control that I'm grieving, part of the danger of the grief journey is everything you think you've lost, you've lost, or you don't even realize you've lost, you're going to try and get it back everywhere else. And so the control I lost in losing my dad and my brother, I could not risk losing control in lesser important areas of my life because it just wasn't adding up. It wasn't filling my control tank, so to speak. And it made me do a lot of spiritual reflection to what I looked to for real strength and hope. And so, that's one of the things that grief did for me.
Well, and I just kind of want to back up. So with your dad, you kind of knew the date was on the horizon. And then with your brother, I mean, it was a surprise. Where were you on the grief process with your dad? And then all of a sudden have your brother walk through this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's what made the year so hard is our whole family had at least two grief journeys going at the same time, layered, but they're at different places. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think by October, this is about 8 months after my dad passed, I think I was getting to a point of acceptance. I prayed for my dad. I asked God to heal him. I also have a theological framework. And I will say this, by the way, about grief. If you're not grieving now, this is a great time to sort out your theology on suffering. Because if you don't have it sorted now, you're not going to be able to sort it once you're in it. You're just going to have to endure whatever your theology actually already is. So I had a theology of suffering that allowed me to trust in a sovereign God who works all things out for his good, who makes all things new, who owes us nothing, who gives us everything, of whom I don't make any demands. And so when my dad got sick and when he got the diagnosis, I wasn't angry at God. I know some people are, and that's, if you are, you need to be honest about that, and God can handle that, of course. I really wasn't. That wasn't my thing. I was sad. And I was sad for my mom, but I wasn't angry. And my dad was never angry. And my dad's approach from the second he got the diagnosis was it's a win-win. God decides to heal me, it's to his glory. And if he takes me, I'm with him. So it's a win-win. It's a loss for us that stay behind, but it's a win-win for him. And so I think by the time my brother passed, I probably was close to acceptance. Not, of course, that's a light, you can be in there for years. And the grief journey is not nearly as linear as we probably would like it to be, or as books make it seem like it could be. Because you're always learning more things you've lost. And you think you knew what you've lost when someone dies, but then when 2 months later, when something happens and you would normally call that person about it, you realize I've also lost that. So I was probably nearing acceptance with my dad. And then when my brother passed, obviously I was right back at just total shock with him.
So when you were at total shock, did you reflect on your dad, or was it, you talked about two different levels. Was it, I think we try to compartmentalize, grief, like, well, today Dave's just grieving his brother's lost, and tomorrow he's just grieving his dad. So, did you feel like it was compartmentalized? Was it more spaghetti? Take us through the weeks after that, walking through that, what that was like.
Yeah, because I'm a pastor and because I'm, again, sort of the oldest male in the family, and because I'm a leader, both when my dad passed and my brother passed, in my shock, I still was highly functional and very on top of getting things done that needed to get done. There's so many details that you don't even realize until you lose someone close to you that you're responsible for. And so many phone calls you have to make, so many things you have to arrange. And then being a pastor, I have to, not have to, but I get to coordinate the services, right? So it's like, and then I shared the message at both services. So there's a certain like level of activity that kind of just keeps you going one foot in front of another for the next couple of weeks. But one thing that comforted us as a family was the thought of my brother and my dad being together again. My dad loved all of us equally, but Josh was the youngest, and there was a special connection with Josh and my dad. And so I think there was something that we just thought, they're together and they have each other. And, obviously theologically, we know that they have Jesus, which matters more than each other, but still it's nice for us to think of them having each other. And so, I think, because I'm task oriented, because I wanted to get stuff done, because my main concern, honestly, was my mom. So when you sort of like, I wouldn't say I set aside my grief, I felt it, but in the midst of my grief, I was ultra aware of how I felt like my mom was doing, because that's a lot, I think she had it the worst, to lose your husband who, her and my dad, some couples, they're together a lot, but they don't work together, right? So they're used to not being with each other for 8 to 9 hours a day. Well, my mom and my dad were never apart. So whether they worked, whether they went to the YMCA, whether they were at the house, they did everything together. So there literally wasn't a place she could go that he shouldn't have been there with her. And so, there was that, and then to lose, your youngest child, I think there's nothing more unnatural than a parent burying a child. And so much of my energy was devoted to, I got to get my mom through this. Like she's got to make this through it. And then feeling the weight of my own family, shepherding my young girls' hearts who were devastated. And so, I guess to answer your question, it was all a little bit, there was a lot of activity, a lot of things to get done, a lot of sorrow, a lot of sadness, and then just sort of this like ongoing level of, I just cannot believe this is where we're at.
So I guess I relate to that a lot. So I guess I'm kind of wondering, your dad passes away, your brother passes away, you're coordinating, you're making all the phone calls. Was there a moment that it all hit you, or was it more of a process of, I mean, you can get punched in the face once by Mike Tyson, or, you can have someone punch you in the gut 20 times. It still probably
Hmm.
hurts, but I mean,
Hmm.
what was it like kind of for you, so to speak?
I think it was, I feel like it was both.
Mm,
There were some pretty intense moments of grief. Um, and then just this steady drip of just, just this weight, this sorrow, this heaviness, I remember just saying, I'm just so sad. It's just that this is an overwhelming sadness of it all. And, you can't, I don't think, it doesn't matter how good of a son you were, how good of a brother you were, how good of a spouse you were, how good of a friend you were. I think it's our nature when someone passes to think, I could have been better, you know? And so, you kind of carry some of that with you too. And so you're sorting it all out. But, you know, there's no doubt that the intensity in my journey, there's no doubt that the intensity of the grief lessens with time.
mm,
Doesn't go away, and it will catch you in the most unexpected moments, like even just now. I mean, I haven't really got emotional about it like that probably in, a couple months. So it's just like you don't always know when it's coming. Initially, it's like just the wave, just a tidal wave, just bam, bam, bam. You can't get on your feet. And then the way I describe it is the waves start to come a little less frequently, a little slower. But sometimes there's some people, there's even a grief in that because they've lost people struggle with this feeling of like, I should never be happy again. And that's how I'm going to honor them and prove my love to them. And that, of course, is not healthy either. So I think for some people, when they start to feel less sad or less frequently sad, then they feel sad about that, as if they've somehow lost some of their love and appreciation for that person. And I think that's a lie.
mm.
I just don't think we can sustain that level of grief. Grief will be with us, I think, forever, but there is an intensity of the grief that is somewhat time specific, in my experience.
Well, and there's two observations with that. I'm just kind of remembering of you. And the first thing is, if anybody follows you on social media, you've just been very open, and I'd even say helpful. Like, I feel like every birthday from your dad and your brother, the anniversary, like, you just, hey, this is who I am. This is part of my story. I just kind of want to remind you, because I don't think people always feel that permission when they grieve. And
Mm.
so I look at that as kind of like a positive activity, but I'll never forget, you and I had this conversation. So we vacation, my family, we vacation at Ocean City, New Jersey every year. And you and
Mm.
I were talking about that, kind of going back and forth. And I think I just made a comment to you and I said, yeah, man, I can't wait for you to get back here. And you made this comment. You're like, that was the last vacation with my dad. You know, I don't I don't think
Mm.
I don't think I'm gonna go back there for a while. And, I
Mm.
just kind of think about how practical that is, because it sounds like in grief, there's some things you do that's positive, and there's other things you're like, I'm just not going there. So how do you negotiate all of that?
Ooh, that's a really good observation, a really good question. I totally understand what you're saying, but I've not broken it down that way in my head before. So it's a hard question for me to answer. But I think that you just got to be as honest as you can about what is wise for you emotionally, what will honor them versus what will unnecessarily, and I say that carefully because I don't want to decide for other people what's necessary and what isn't. But there is a point in which um, we almost lean into the grief journey for the purpose of, I don't know how to say this. Like, again, like I'm going to chase down experiences that are going to make me sad. I
Mm,
don't know if that makes sense. Or I'm going
mm,
to put myself in positions where I'm going to cry again. And if that's what someone needs to do at different times in their grief journey, that's okay. But the danger of grief, so to get a little pastoral on this conversation, the danger of grief is loss, right? Grief is always related to loss. And when you lose something, so one of the dangers that I see as a pastor in the lives of people, both Christians and non-Christians, is that every single human being is wired to build their identity around something or someone. We just can't find a way forward without that. We so desperately need an identity. And so when you lose something or someone that was your identity, the danger of that is that you have to replace it with something.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can't replace it with good things or with God himself, then some people replace their loss of a person with, they replace that person with the actual experience of having lost them. So now their new identity becomes that they are a person who has lost much, that they are that they're a widow, that they're the father of a deceased child. And while that always will be part of your identity, when it becomes your primary identity, then you have to feed it, right?
Mm.
And so, I know I'm being a little theoretical in here, and maybe, I don't know, hopefully this will be helpful and not in any way disrespectful to listeners, but this is just an observation I've had. My identity is not wrapped around a deceased father or a deceased brother. My identity is wrapped around Christ, who he is and what he's done. And so it stabilizes me. It doesn't mean the grief isn't there, the sorrow isn't there. It doesn't mean I don't have questions. It doesn't mean I don't have doubts. It doesn't mean I don't have frustrations. It means that ultimately I don't need to fill my identity back up when I lose someone with something unhealthy, which sometimes happens. People make their identity the victim or the person who has lost so much. And while that's all true and you need to own it, it also shouldn't be your core sense of who you are.
I think what you're saying makes a ton of sense. So I'm married to a counselor. My mother-in-law is a counselor. So I'll never forget, we got forced, I shouldn't say forced, I loved it, to see Inside Out. And that movie would look totally different if sadness was running the show as opposed to joy.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're talking about is for some of us, and that's why that movie's so brilliant. Maybe adults like it more than kids, is like you can all see like there's that moment when the anger just runs the dad. And then, but you can definitely tell that is sadness, which played by Phyllis from The Office. If sadness is running the show, like you're out of equilibrium.
Yeah. Yes. And by the way, I don't know if it's the same people who made Inside Out, but my family and I just watched Soul last night on Disney Plus, and it's got a similar sort of vibe to Inside Out. I love Soul. I thought it was a very well done, worth watching, and with some really interesting points about sorrow and suffering and grief. But I do feel like in the midst of all this suffering, one of the things I've learned is you cannot underestimate the value of even sorrow and suffering and loss, and you can't underestimate its power. The value is that it can, in of itself, be a gift to you. And some of the ways in which loss and sorrow and suffering and grief was a gift to me is it, first off, practically speaking, it revealed to me that I had more than I thought I had all along in support from family and from friends and from people in the community. And it just was this unbelievable reminder of how loved I was and how loved my family was. And you don't see that outpouring any other time quite like when there's grief. And maybe that's a bad thing, but it's reality, But also I just realized like suffering can be a gift if it exposes that I've been putting my hope and trust in the wrong things or in the wrong people. And it does have a way of doing that. Suffering will really expose who you love most, what you trust in most. And that matters so much that if suffering does that for us, then it can be a gift. But it also has the power to really become our master, to really become our Lord, so to speak, and to really own us and control us and define us, and ultimately to destroy us. And so, I think you have to have appreciation for what it is and what it can bring us and what it can teach us of Christ, and also be aware of its power. And, one of the things I love about the Christian faith is that, I don't know who said this, but the Christianity is the only faith that at the center of it is the suffering and humiliation of its own God. Mm-hmm. And so we serve a God who the scripture says was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And he knows sorrow and separation and pain beyond anything that any of us will experience. And so that gives me hope in all situations that Jesus suffered, not so that I wouldn't suffer, but so that my suffering would not be without end and that my suffering would not be without meaning. And, that's very helpful for me that year.
Well, I kind of want to move forward. in this sense. You have a youngest daughter. I'm a big fan of youngest. I'm the third child in my family, and so one of the things we talked about before the show was, your youngest Maddie has cerebral palsy, I believe,
Yep.
and we just kind of talked about a little bit of the grief with that. And, I want to be careful of using the word suffering, but in some ways, you even mentioned this before, there's a grief with kind of every milestone. And, you're on Instagram and you're telling her story. I think I saw Christmas that, you know, even if you listen to any sermon illustrations and, I listen to Trinity, even though I don't go there. And, you'll talk about Maddie, like she wants to be in the middle of everything. She's got two older siblings. Here she is on Christmas Day getting on the air hockey table. Like, I mean, there is just nothing to
Yeah.
deter her, but, she's going to live the rest of her life kind of going through this. How has
Yep.
your past grief kind of informed you with this grief? And how are you and your wife and your kids kind of walking through that?
Yeah, we got some great advice early on. So Maddie was born in 2014. She was born at 27 weeks. She suffered a grade 4 brain hemorrhage in utero and spent the first 79 days of her life in the NICU. Had multiple brain surgeries and has had surgery since then. And her primary diagnosis is cerebral palsy. She also has epilepsy and a few other things. But we received some great advice early on from people who had walked through something similar. And it was basically, you have to realize that so we thought she wouldn't survive birth. So when you go into the emergency C-section and that's your starting point, then everything from there is gravy on top, So it didn't feel like grief at first. It felt like, oh my goodness, she's alive. She's going to make it. She's going to come home. And then she starts hitting certain milestones where we realize she's verbal, she's smart, she has a personality, because those things are all sort of, we didn't know if they were on the card, so to speak. And then, you get the diagnosis, she has cerebral palsy, and there's a huge spectrum of people with cerebral palsy. So you even still have hope, like maybe she'll be on this end of the spectrum and not this end of the spectrum. And, so it doesn't feel like grief. But then, I think of like, when she starts saying things like, because her left hand is great, her right hand and her legs don't work right, or well, I should say. When she says to you all of a sudden, I'm not a very good clapper, and she's realizing like, I can't, my right hand doesn't, I want to clap louder and I can't. Or she sees other kids running around and she's like, I want to do, then all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness, like this is really hard. This is sad, and, so I'm going to be grieving. There's things that I did with my other daughters I'll never do with Maddie, teaching them certain sports, how to ride a bike, someday walking them down the aisle. I mean, Maddie could get married someday, but she most likely will not walk down the aisle, So there's these, and there's things even smaller than that you realize like, oh, we're never going to have this with her. And you do kind of have to name and own that loss. And then just also sort of the juxtaposition of that versus all the things that we do have, and to be so thankful. And I think that's so important in grief and sorrow is, the two things I think that helped me the most besides my faith and my family was sort of to intentionally find things to be grateful for every day, and also to continue to serve others. Mm-hmm. Like one of the things that grief can do is it can make you such a sort of navel gazer that you just kind of like, you're so focused on how you're feeling and how you're doing and you forget like there's a lot of people hurting and everybody's lost something and everybody's going through sorrow and everybody's going through grief. It's different than yours. But there's people that need your story. They need your strength. They need your nearness. They need your presence. They need your friendship. And there's nothing about grief that should ultimately steal from us the ability to help others walk through theirs. In fact, the Bible teaches clearly that it's through the grief and the experiences that we have that we're going to be most effective in ministering to other people. So Aaron and I are positioned now to minister to families with kids with special needs in a way that we were not 7 years ago. And, that's a gift. Now, it's a costly gift. It means that we have a little girl who can't walk. But at the same time, we choose to embrace the whole thing as, God, what have you done here to glorify yourself, to advance your kingdom, and to help us do what you've called us to do?
I I kind of see just what you just said through the lens of my family. My sister's a cancer survivor, and she's, at 7 years old, she had a tumor. She had one kidney removed. And, whenever I was a kid and I had to go to the bathroom, she'd always remind me, I have one kidney, you can hold it. But,
That's great.
I'm thinking about this. When Susan had cancer, there was a Charlie Brown, Why Charlie Brown, Why? And there's the scene where Linus comes to the two siblings and says, where's your sister? And they're like, you only come for my sister. And I think about that, like, and if my brother was on the episode now, he'd say, if I ever get green mint chocolate chip ice cream again, I'm just going to throw it. Because that's kind of what happened. Like, all of
Yeah,
a sudden,
yeah.
all this attention. And so, I guess I'm kind of in the grief journey. You're also trying to help your kids. And I'm thinking of Lila and Caroline. How have you kind of walked with them? Because it's not always, and I think this is unfair, it's not always like a jealousy thing. Like, I don't think anybody sits there like, I want this to happen to my sister, but you notice this undue attention. You should be thankful.
Yeah.
I mean, how are you walking, through your daughters with that?
Listen, that's a real thing you're describing. And actually, how there's a lot of data out there on how marriages don't often survive the loss of a child.
Mm.
And there's also data on how marriages often do not survive the birth of a special needs child.
Mm.
And I don't have that study in front of me, but I've seen it and read it. And I think it takes, so to use a kind of like a term that everybody's throwing around, it takes a lot of emotional IQ, right? A lot of awareness of how you're feeling, how other people in the room are feeling, how your girls are doing. But for us, like, so my girls are born on the 18th and the 19th of a month. So Lilia, it was February 19th. Lilia is May 19th and Caroline is February 18th. And so in my calendar, my iCal, every month on the 18th, it says Caroline Day. And on the 19th, it says Lilia Day. And it's just my reminder of like this one day a month, like I'm going to go get a meal with this girl. I'm going to take her out. Because you're right, like in crisis, all the energy of the family goes to supporting one individual. And kids can feel, even though they know they shouldn't feel that way, which actually makes it worse, they can feel somewhat jealous of like, this person gets all the attention. And then they actually begin to act out in other ways just to secure some of that attention that they desperately need from their parents. So it's been a lot of intentionality on mine and Aaron's part to make sure that the girls don't quote unquote suffer because of some of the things that we're having to do to serve Maddie. But also, we've really let them be a part of everything in Maddie's life. So they have a good understanding and a real appreciation for her challenges. And they're tremendously kind to her. And I don't think they feel like, she's had some really cool opportunities opened up to her. Like she's a part of the Syracuse women's lacrosse team, for example. But every time she goes to visit them, the girls go too, so they kind of share this journey together. But what I think you're saying is something that needs to be talked about in families with kids who have special needs or who have a health crisis. You do have to be intentional about how are you continuing to love and care for the other children who can very often feel like their needs are not as important.
Mm. Wow. Man, we could just kind of go on, and it's funny, so we send all of our guests like 6 or 7 questions, and like we just kind of went up, and where I want to kind of close, and you've kind of hit on this all the way, and it's funny the way I worded it. We do this question, what does Jesus have to say about it? And I worded it, what does Jesus have to say about grief not having an end date? And so I'm gonna let you think about it. If John was here, he'd probably start with me. So I have to respond to this question, and then, kind of let you, and, as I've been thinking about this topic, so the hard thing about answering this question, we have to answer this for every episode on grief. And I guess you just have to find out exactly what the Bible says. And, I guess I've just kind of been thinking about, what does Jesus say about grief not having an end date? And I just kind of go back to David's story. There's someone with a lot of grief in their life. And, I guess I wouldn't push back on someone to tell them, look for that end date. But I guess what I think Jesus would say, you look at David writing the Psalms, you look at all these laments, was I don't think God forces you to have this end date on this side of eternity. And,
Hmm.
I think about this question, why doesn't my grief have an end date? Um, I'm not saying that you won't have an end date on this side of eternity, but I also don't think you need to put the pressure on yourself to have one, because I think there's examples throughout scripture and even Jesus that they walked through this. And, I think one of the things that we're finding out in this series is like everybody grieves differently. And I think the biggest thing that I'm kind of picking up from you is I think everybody grieving differently does not give you license to be sad all the time, but it does give you license to say, stop, this is what's happening. So if I did any heresy, you get to clean it up as usual, but it's all good. What does Jesus have to say about grief not having an end date?
Yeah, no, I appreciate how you said that, because like you, I would avoid telling people how they should necessarily feel. I would say push beneath your feelings and think through what have you lost, and what does Jesus have to say about the thing that you've lost,
Mm,
and who is Jesus in comparison to the thing that you've lost. And the Bible is so honest about suffering and grief and sorrow. So many of the Psalms is about lament, and lament is sort of this lost art in the American church today. We feel like we lament things because a bill got passed or because somebody got elected to a position that we didn't want. That's, when the book of Revelation was written to encourage the early believers, they were lamenting over a guy named Domitian who was killing tens of thousands of Christians. Comparative, right? What we lament, but we need to lament is honest. It's God directed. It is raw, but it ultimately Jesus has the final word even in our lament. And so when you say, what would Jesus say about this? I think first off about what he's already said about it. And the clearest thing that Jesus ever said about our suffering was when he went to the cross and suffered in our place. And I'm so thankful for that, for what it means for me personally, but also that it means I have a God who is not unaware of the human experience, rejected, abandoned. Most people believe lost his father, and then ultimately went to the cross. But, when I also think of what Jesus having the final word on grief, I think of heaven. I thought of heaven so much in 2017, way more than I ever had in my life. And when I think of heaven, I forget who says this, which book this is. Three things about heaven. Number one, in heaven, you and I will serve Jesus the way we wish we always had.
mm,
And that just does so much for my heart and gives me so much hope. Secondly, in heaven, Jesus will heal all of our wounds, not just our big ones, but the ones we're not even aware of, the things that we're grieving that we don't know we're grieving, things that we should be grieving that we aren't grieving. And then lastly, in heaven, Jesus will lead us into ever increasing joy. There is this idea that you get to heaven and it's amazing, and then you just kind of hope the amazing holds out for all of eternity. And I love the idea. C.S. Lewis, in his last book of the Chronicles of Narnia, I think it's called The Last Battle, he talks about the very end, how all of life now, symbolizing moving into the next life, this life that we live now is the cover and the title page of a book. But our first day in heaven is chapter 1 of our actual life. And it's a book where every chapter is better than the one before it. There's nothing in this world that gives us increasing joy, I don't think. There's a diminishing enjoyment of things, whether it's food, the first bite's the best, whether it's the first time you go to a movie theater versus the 100th time, the first time you go to a live sporting event versus the 100th. It just all kind of eventually everything gets old. The glory fades of everything on this earth. The glory fades. Jesus is the one who the glory will increase forever and ever, and forever he'll lead us to ever increasing in joy. And with him, every day with him in eternity will be better than the day before. And we'll be with those that we've lost and those that we love. And for me, that's the final word on grief. No more sorrow, no more suffering, no more tears, no more pain. All the sad things will come untrue, and we'll reign with Jesus.
Folks, Usually I say I hope you enjoy this episode. I hope this episode was meaningful to you. I think we're all grieving somehow, but I also think you're learning about people that are probably grieving in ways that you haven't. And so, Dave, I just want to thank you for just being raw and honest. I think that this is going to be helpful to many people. We're going to be tagging Dave in all of our posts. You can find him at David Hertweck. I'm phonetically pronouncing it the way I try to spell it right. So anyways, if I get that wrong, but make sure you follow him.
Good.
Make sure you also, just as you share this episode, and especially this one, I feel like there's a lot of people that this will just really connect with. So use hashtag WGW podcast. We are at WGW podcast for Instagram and Twitter and then Facebook. And then you can go to our website, whygodwhypodcast.com. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so glad to have you here.